Hey film fans, who makes movies? Who is the artist? What is a filmmaker? What does a director do on set? Is a movie director an artist? Is a movie director the artist? What does any of that have to do with an author? Let's find out more as we explore the role of the auteur on this episode of The Rise and Fall of New Hollywood. Hey everybody, auteur is just the French word for author. What does that have to do with filmmaking? Well, the answer is multiplicitous. The answer has many strands, and the answer changes depend on who's being asked. There's only so much I can say about this in a short, or let's say shortish video. So I want to talk really about what role the concept of the auteur played in 1970s Hollywood. But to do that, we have to backtrack along a couple different strands of history, tie them up, and then also talk about how they split up again. First is the idea of the director as the kind of, let's say, artistic owner of the film. This is not an idea that always existed in Hollywood. So today when you see something like the fifth film by Quentin Tarantino or a Martin Scorsese film, those are called possessory credits. They imply possession, and that possession comes from the sense that the director of the film is, in a way, not so much its owner, because usually the studio or whoever owns the film, but is its artistic forebear, its artistic progenitor, its artistic owner, in a way. And that was not always the case. For the first half of Hollywood history or more, it was the producer, usually, who was seen as kind of the owner of the film. And if you go back to the classical era of Hollywood, if you watch Gone with the Wind, David O. Selznick's name comes up, I think, 3 or 4 times on screen before we have any notion of who the director of the film is. When you look at the Academy Awards today, you might find yourself asking, why does the producer get the award for best film? Shouldn't it be the director? Well, that's because the Academy Awards were born in the era of the producer-driven film, and the producers and the studio heads invented the Academy Awards, so of course they're going to give themselves the award for the best film. Now, there were some exceptions to this. D.W. Griffith thought of the films that he directed as his films. Chaplin was so talented that a lot of people inside and outside of the studios thought of Chaplin-directed films as Chaplin's films. But even directors who today are considered great auteurs, like Hitchcock, in most of his first films, he was not the first credit. This wasn't a Hitchcock film. This was a Selznick film or somebody else at the studio. It was only later when Hitchcock started to get top billing. How did this come about, that the concept of who a film belonged to or who created a film would shift from the producers, who at the time were the power in Hollywood, to the director, who at the time was mostly considered a hired hand? Obviously, some were more successful than others, but they were still a hired hand. And if you watched my video about the industrial roots, you know that the studios owned the directors for the most part, and the producers told the directors what to do, which script to work with, which cinematographer to work with, and so on. And as you became a kind of a John Ford or a Howard Hawks, you had more say in that, but you were still, at the time, considered a hired hand. Well, there's a lot of reasons for this shift, but a major one has to do with a little magazine in Paris, or what at the time was a little magazine in Paris called Cahiers du Cinéma, which basically just means cinema notebook. And there was a young group of writers, passionate film viewers, film goers, film defenders, writing for this magazine in the 1950s. Why is that important? Well, France was still coming out of the Second World War and the effects of the Second World War. And not to get too much into a history lesson here, but much of France had been controlled indirectly by Nazi Germany. And as a result of that, a lot of films and a lot of filmmaking were banned, including most Hollywood films. So after the war was over, Hollywood films started to come to France quickly. Films from the 40s, John Ford films, Howard Hawks films. And these made a big impression on these French filmgoers. At the same time, the French cinema was in the thrall of what these writers would call the tradition of quality. And this was, at the time, a very writerly, literary French cinema. Now, there were filmmakers like Renoir and others who were already making films in the 20s, 30s, and into the 40s. But the kind of mainstream French cinema at the time was a literary cinema, a writer's cinema. And this got these young writers thinking, who makes films? Who is the artist? Is it the writer? These aren't books. This is a visual, a sonic, a sound medium for the senses. And they started to develop this idea of the auteur. Now, it had its sort of antecedents in earlier film theory, including French film theory. There was a writer named Auteur who came up with this idea called the camera stylo, or the camera as a pen, and that the director used the camera as a pen to write the film. And so the Cahiers writers built on that. And in 1954, a guy named Francois Truffaut wrote a film called A Certain Tendency in French Cinema, in which he lambasted the French cinema of the day. He destroyed what he called the tradition of quality. And he took to task the idea that cinema was a writer's medium. And he used this word auteur, or author, to counterpose the director with the screenwriter. The screenwriter might write the script, the screenwriter might develop some of the themes, but it's the director who writes the film. This was not a new idea, but Truffaut's sort of polemic, the vivacity, the fervor with which he made his argument was kind of new. It was a young, at the time, a young cinema goer's cry to rethink the way we understand cinema. And to make his argument that cinema was a director's medium, Truffaut argued that we should move away from looking strictly at thematic development, at character arcs and narrative arcs and things like that. Literary devices that film used and borrowed from, but that weren't, to Truffaut, the kind of heart and soul of the movies. That was the visual. You come across this word a lot, the mise en scène. Mise en scène is just a French term. It comes from theater. That means something like within the scene, all that's within the scene. And you can get 100 different answers for the question, what is the mise en scène? But it generally means production design, cinematography, lighting. Right here, the mise en scène is the fish tank, the guitar, the Polish poster for The Last Detail, me, my shirt, these glasses, the lighting, which sometimes you can see reflected in my glasses, and so on. This would be the mise en scène here. And Truffaut argued that that's what makes cinema. And then you can add on top of that, not just the frame, but how the frame changes, the camera movement. That is cinema. And then in addition to that, eventually, the editing. How do we cut from one scene to another? Because that is cinema. Over the next few years, the writers for Cahiers du Cinéma, many of whom would later become filmmakers themselves, which is an important part of this story, like Truffaut, Rohmer, Godard, and the sort of godfather of Cahiers du Cinéma, André Bazin, argued in the pages of the magazine about what makes an auteur. And they had disagreements. It was sometimes quite vociferous, but there were a few things that they agreed on, and they started applying their auteurist readings to Hollywood cinema. Because at the time, the French cinema was still in this kind of tradition of quality, and these writers would look at Hollywood cinema and say, look, here's an example where the directors are creating texts for the screen. But at that time, as you know, films were controlled by the studio system. So as these writers started to debate, how do we detect Ford's presence in a film? How do we detect Hawke's presence in the film when a lot of what's going on in these films is studio mandated? Well, there was an elan, a spirit, an attention to detail that you could discern in the films of certain directors despite studio constraints. And that's a very important point to make about the early days of the auteur concept, is that these writers recognized that the studios controlled the filmmaking, but the directors were able, through their artistry, through their temperament, through the subtlety of their attention to detail, these directors were able to imbue their films with their own personalities, with their own spirit, as they sometimes said, so that you could look at a Ford film, according to these writers, and see that's a Ford film because of the way he shot Monument Valley, because of the way he framed his actors against the landscape, because of the way he used irony to distance his men from the concept of men in the West. In movie circles, these writings, which were in French, first kind of spread into the Anglosphere by word of mouth. And then some British and American film critics started to translate these writings, but also they didn't just translate the writings, they rewrote them in a sense. They interpreted the writings and reformulated them for their own sort of film markets. And in America, this happened mainly through the writer Andrew Sarris. And he publishes in the early 60s an essay called Notes on the Auteur Theory. In the UK, this happened through a collection of writers, mostly working at Movie Magazine. And one of the main writers there was a guy named Ian Cameron. And Cameron and others, and Sarris in America, took the auteurist writings of the French and kind of repositioned them, in a sense, so that they weren't only talking about the idea of a director's spirit coming through the film despite studio constraints, but they started talking about the director as the only one whose spirit could be detected, the only artist involved in the making of the film. That had been an implication in the Cahiers writers' work, but once these English language writers started taking it, it became central, that this was about and only about film directors. In fact, writing in 1962 in an issue of Movie, Ian Cameron wrote, "The assumption which underlies all the writing in Movie is that the director is the author of a film, the person who gives it any distinctive quality it may have." Cameron goes on to say there are exceptions to this, and in some cases the writer might be the author, and in some few rare cases the cinematographer might be the author. But even in those cases, Cameron argues that there's only one. That if the director is not the auteur, it's because the writer has put his stamp on it. If neither of them are the auteur, it's because the cinematographer has put his stamp on it. But it's almost always the director. And they're only writing about directors, so they're not writing so much about writers or cinematographers. what does this have to do with New Hollywood? Well, there are two very important developments that come out of this early 60s period. First, as I mentioned in the video on the movie brats, many of the men who would become the directors of the New Hollywood era were entering film school in the early 60s. So as they're entering film school, these ideas of the cahier writers are being translated or transcribed or reinterpreted into English. Second, by the early 60s, those writers at the Cahiers du Cinéma were becoming directors, and they were becoming the directors of the French New Wave. I also talked about that in the video on Movie Brats, how influential those French New Wave filmmakers were to the eventual directors of New Hollywood. So what you have is this moment in time in the early to mid 60s when a lot of young people are studying how to make films, and they're studying how to make films in a context that says the director is the artist, and that says some of the films that you most love, some of the films that you find most exciting, some of the best films in the world at this time are being directed by the men who developed this theory. The auteurist writers have become auteurs. Now, you're a young film school student. That is something to aspire to. At the same time, people like Saris and others are writing in popular magazines, not academic magazines, in popular magazines, popular publications, writing books about the director as the preeminent artist behind a film. So throughout the 60s, this idea starts to grow. If you remember the video from a few episodes back on the industrial roots, then you know that by this period, by the 60s, the studio system is starting to fall apart. And I'll talk more about that in the next episode. And this idea of the all-powerful studio head, the all-powerful producer, is diminishing. And who is going to step into that place of power? The artist, the director, the person who movie culture has been making an argument for 10 years now, 15 years by 1969, that the director is the artist. The director is the sole person from whom derives anything of merit in a film. The auteur. Now, while this notion of the auteur took off in the 60s and into the early 70s, it wasn't without criticism. The well-known movie critic from the New York Magazine, Pauline Kael, famously had a sort of war of words with Andrew Saris in which she tried to debunk Auteurism, and that eventually led to her writing her sort of ill-fated, but if you ask me, well-intentioned Citizen Kane book, and her analysis of the script of Citizen Kane, which in a way leads to David Fincher's Mank from last year. Richard Corliss, who just passed away a few years ago and was a long-running American film critic, argued in the early 70s that no, the screenwriter is the author of the film. It's not the director, and the director is building on that blueprint. So there were articulate and thoughtful pockets of resistance to Auteurism, but it was such a captivating idea for so many reasons that it really took hold. And what are some of those reasons? They're hard to pin down, but first, Romanticism. And by Romanticism, I mean the idea of singular genius, right? William Wordsworth called poetry the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling, something like that. And so this idea that there was one artist from whom all the beauty, all the vigor, all the thoughtfulness spills forth already existed. And this was at a time when film was struggling to be taken seriously as an art form. So one argument to make is, if film is art, there must be an artist. Who's the artist? It must be the director. It's also easier, right? If you want to talk about Scorsese, then you talk about Scorsese films. Do you want to talk about Scorsese films with Chapman, Scorsese films with Ballhaus, Scorsese films with Richardson, and differentiate. I do. I love that. But for offhand movie conversations, it's easier just to say Scorsese, Wells, Kubrick, and so on. Plus, you have a reorientating of how the film goer, the film viewer, thought about films, and thinking about them as art with artists and thinking about them as the products of their directors was an exciting part of this new movie-going experience. And so even though there were these pockets of resistance, they were generally, from the 60s until the early 70s at least, they were generally shouted down. Now, around the early 1970s, Auteurism sort of split into two strains or two streams, really more than two, many, but it's kind of easier to think about them as two: the academic or scholarly approach and the sort of critical or popular approach. And I don't want to spend too much time on the academic approach because that didn't really feed in to the conceptions around New Hollywood, but it kind of wraps back around to what I want to say at the end. The gist is that by the early 1970s, a lot of arts and humanities departments were grappling with post-structuralism. And this is a huge concept that I can only begin to explain, the sort of tip of the iceberg here. Just know that post-structuralism was hugely influential on the way that the disciplines, the academic disciplines around the arts conceptualized the process of making art and the process of engaging with art. And to vastly oversimplify, the gist was the author was only one of the mechanisms for structuring meaning. And you could apply that to painting, you could apply that to theater, you could apply that to literature, and you could apply that to cinema. An author, an artist, makes certain decisions, has certain intentions, and they do things for certain reasons. In the case of film, they might choose to shoot a still shot, or they might tilt or pan the camera, or they might push the camera and move it. They might make choices about editing, they might make choices about color, they might make choices about staging, and so on. The director, the cinematographer, the production designer, all these people are going to make these decisions that go into the creation of the film, right? Just like an author writes down a paragraph and a page and a chapter and a book and so on. And that process, that intentionality, organizes the potential for meaning. But in post-structuralism, the viewer or the reader or whatever else it might be also contributes to that potential for meaning. And this happens in a lot of ways, but let's think of two at least. One is the individual's response. So I watch a film, I'm sitting there with my best friend. We went to school together, we've grown up together, our family backgrounds are similar. We're both on the swim team. And we watch a film and we walk out and I'm like, oh my God, that was amazing. Did you see that? I can't believe they did this. And this is what it means to me. And my friend is like, what are you talking about? That film was awful. Nothing about it worked. This is what it means to me. And we've both experienced the same film at the same time, but we have different individual interpretations. Now, you can only take this so far. You can't say like, oh, I hate the way The Godfather is about the mining of green cheese on the moon. I exaggerate, but you know, the meaning comes out of some engagement with the text or the film or the book or whatever it is. But if we're engaging with that material, based on our own personal experiences, we might come away from it with a different interpretation. And you get a lot of these arguments about intention versus interpretation. And somewhere in the middle, they meet. And different people have different interpretations based on all kinds of things: age, gender, race, economic background, religion, and a variety of other sort of factors that go into making you who you are. A second interpretive kind of angle to think about is cultural context. And this has to do with history, with the social and economic factors at the time, all sorts of things. And an obvious example of that is when we watch a film in 2021 from 1971, and for example, the racism, the blatant racism is so obvious to us today. Now, for black cinema goers in 1971, the racism was probably obvious too. And Hollywood had a structural problem in that it wasn't allowing black filmmakers to make films. And so most depictions of black people in American cinema in the early 70s were crafted by white people. Not always, but mostly. But a lot of white film goers, because they were in a context in which racism was perceived differently than it is today, might have looked at that film and been like, right? And that's uncomfortable because some of our classic films are laden with racism or colonialism or sexism or pretty graphic examples of gendered violence and things like that. So we can look at that film, a film like that today, and go, that doesn't work because through my sensibilities in 2021, I can't look beyond the gendered or the racial violence, for example. Whereas in 1971, filmgoers might have been able to do that. And it doesn't even have to be anything so drastic as racism or sexism. Probably many of you watching this have had the experience of watching Citizen Kane for the first time. And everyone your whole life, once you started paying attention to movies, was like, Citizen Kane is the best film of all time. And you sat down and you watch it and you're like, wait, what?
Have you ever tried to sit through Citizen Kane?
Yeah, I know, it's really boring, but it's like a big deal.
Yeah.
Partly because many of the things, not all of the things, and I think Citizen Kane's a great film, but many of the things that made it great for so long are things having to do with the camera angle, the narrative development, the linearity or alinearity of the storytelling, the performances, showing the ceilings, all of this kind of stuff that movies did, you know, they replicated afterwards, so that by the time you were 21 and you watched Citizen Kane, you'd seen all of that stuff before. That's another example of the cultural context. Things that seem groundbreaking 50 years ago, 80 years ago, don't seem groundbreaking to today's eyes. So you make a different meaning from watching that film. Now, what this post-structuralism did for film studies was it created the possibility for a sort of multiplicity of film theories in the 1970s. And the 1970s is one of the first great eras of film theory. So you had feminist theory, you had psychoanalytic theory, you had Marxist film theory, you had eventually kind of post-colonial film theory, and so on. And what all of those film theories did, and they did a lot of different things, but what all of them did was, if we look at the film through this lens, feminism, black feminism, post-colonial black feminism, and so on, we interpret this differently from if we look at it through a different lens. And this was an era of great film theories articulating different ways to watch, engage with, and understand film. Now, what does this have to do with auteurism? A lot of these film theories kind of eschewed auteurism on their surface. We're not concerned with the director. We're not looking for these great men. We're looking at what the films actually mean if we break them down based on this theoretical model. What are these films doing? So you have Laura Mulvey explaining very articulately, very cleverly, what the male gaze is, what it does, how it presents images to men in the audience, but then also how it presents those images to women in the audience. And she provides a sort of matrix for understanding that. But even as she's talking about framing, camera movement, editing, she's still only talking about Hitchcock. She's still only talking about directors. And So even as these different streams or strains of film theory branched off into their own directions and created subgroups and so on, for the most part, they remained focused on the figure of the director. So even though they weren't auteurist on the surface, they were often enmeshed in auteurism. The second of those two streams I mentioned is really kind of two parallel streams that are not the same, but that are closely engaged with each other. And that's film criticism and sort of popular film thinking. And the reason I say they're more closely engaged is because academic film theory, which is important, I think, and does kind of create contexts for thinking around film, is often kind of buried in film journals and in expensive books, which are less accessible and less current. You know, academics will spend a long time articulating an idea that might not see publication until 2 years, 4 years, 10 years after a film's come out, whereas film criticism is written the day after the critic sees the film, published the next day, and then audiences can talk about it. And so it's informing the sort of contemporary popular conceptions about film in real time almost. And by the 70s, the concept of the auteur was dominant in popular film criticism. Like I said, Pauline Kael and others were sort of against it, but even if you read Pauline Kael's articles from the New Yorker in the 1970s, you'll see that she has favorite directors. She favors talking about directors. Altman comes up again and again, Friedkin comes up, Coppola, and so on. So while she does talk about writers and definitely performers on occasion, her criticism is still kind of centered on the director as the artist. Yeah. As the decade went on and as this new Hollywood era progressed, the center of popular film discourse became wedded to auteurism and the auteur concept. And this wasn't just the way that people thought about films being made, that there was only a director somehow and the film came about, but also the way films were promoted, the way they were distributed, and since then, the way film retrospectives happen, the way films get put out on DVDs or in DVD box sets, the way films are taught, the way film publishing works, so that for the 1970s, the director remains the kind of creative center from various vantage points: filmmaking, film production, teaching, and so on. How did we get here, and why does it matter? Well, I've just laid out how we got here, and it comes up in the previous two videos in this series. Basically, as the 60s turned into the 70s, the old Hollywood system was going through a massive transformation. A lot of the old studio heads, the old producers, the power behind the films of the classical era, they were retiring or even dying. And the studios were being bought by large conglomerations. I'll talk about this in the next video. And they were now often being run by people who didn't always understand movies or who didn't come from a production background. While this is happening, this new generation of filmmakers, or these two overlapping generations, as I explained in the previous video, start making films that don't cost a lot of money, but that bring in a lot of box office. So it looks like they have the answers. And concurrent with both of these things is this auteurist notion creeping out of this French film magazine into English language publications, into film schools, and into the heads of the people making the films and the people writing about the films, so that this idea of auteurism becomes popularized at a time when directors are the easy front-facing personalities behind a lot of these great films. And so it becomes quite easy and quite popular to talk about directors as the film artists. Why does it matter? Well, for a couple of reasons. First of all, that was happening in contemporary New Hollywood. The directors were taking on this role, some of them reluctantly. Some of them, Sidney Lumet would say, I never thought of myself as an auteur. Hal Ashby said, I didn't think of myself as an auteur. But others, quite forcefully. Arthur Penn, I was an auteur. Paul Schrader said, you walk into an office and point at the producer and say, let me tell you how I'm going to make you money. And then they'd give you the money and you'd go out and make your vision for a film. Critics were writing about films based on the directors. It's happening during the period. And so as film scholars and critics started writing the history of that period, more often than not, they accepted that framing, this idea of the 70s as a director's cinema. And that framing remains. So if you go out and try to find a book about the 70s, it's very often going to be director-centered. And you can find plenty of books about those directors. There are a ton of books about Scorsese, Friedkin, Coppola, Kubrick, Woody Allen, Altman, and so on. Can you find a book about Gordon Willis? Last I checked, I don't think so. Can you find a book about Dede Allen? Last I checked, no you cannot. Can you find a book about Richard Silbert? No, you cannot. And so that framing that was established during New Hollywood has stayed with us. But I said there were two reasons. That's one. Two, that framing has also become the infrastructure for how we think about film today. It's stayed with us. This is why I call it the auteur paradigm, because it's part and parcel with film discourse, at least in English. So you'll meet a lot of film scholars who say, oh, I'm not an auteurist, and they're not. They don't practice auteur theory. They don't focus maybe on specific directors. A lot of them still do, but you'll meet a lot of film scholars who don't. But their work is still affected by the auteur paradigm because they often ascribe those elements of a film that they're analyzing to the director, just like Laura Mulvey did back in 1974. So feminist, post-colonial, Marxist, race theorists, neo-Lacanians, all of these people, whatever strand of theory they're working in, tend to abide by the director as the center. I mean, it's embedded in film studies so thoroughly that when you're writing and you name the title of a film, in parentheses you put the director's name and the year. It's embedded structurally in film studies and film criticism. Why is this a problem? Directors are great. Writing about directors is great. Discussing directors is great. Why is it a problem? Because it's an inaccurate understanding of how films get made, and it's an inaccurate understanding of the artistry of filmmaking. And I'll probably do another video on auteurism in general somewhere down the line. But just to pull this back to an understanding of the relationship between auteurism and New Hollywood. The concept of the auteur flourished, or had its first real popular flourishing, during the New Hollywood period. And the producers, the distributors, and the directors of that period embraced it. Historians of the era have also, for the most part, embraced it. So what you get is an understanding of an artistic and historical era framed by a theoretical construct that I would argue is too limited to really understand what was going on in the crafting of those amazing films. Let me know if you disagree. A lot of people have strong opinions about the auteur. Maybe you think I've got it all wrong. Drop a comment down below and let me know what you think. Also, if you've been watching my videos and you found them enlightening, educational, maybe you've shared one with a friend or two friends. If so, I'd really love it if you'd hit the subscribe button. It helps me out quite a bit. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time, I'm Aaron Hunter. Keep watching movies.